Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Scriptura. In this video, we'll walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 38. These are issues that anyone who's doing serious study of the psalm is going to have to deal with, and each of these 3 issues impacts how you understand the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 38, the top 3 issues are the meaning of the phrase להזכיר in the superscription, the function of the key in verse 16, and a textual issue in verse 20. Does verse 20 describe David's enemies as vigorous or as people opposing him for no reason? The first issue in Psalm 38 has to do with the superscription, verse 1 in the Hebrew text. The superscription contains 3 words, or 3 noun phrases, Mizmor LeDavid LeHazkir. The first 2 words are very common in the Psalter, a psalm of David, or a psalm written by David, as we've understood it. The third word, or the third phrase, is more rare, LeHazkir. It occurs just 2 times in the Psalter, once in the superscription of Psalm 70, and once here in the superscription of Psalm 38. Now, the morphology of the phrase is clear. It's an infinitive construct with a prefixed lamed preposition. It's in the hifil stem, and it comes from the root zachar. What's not clear is the meaning of the phrase in this context. Some translations, like the NJPS translation, simply transliterate the term. They spell out the Hebrew word using English letters, lahazkir. But most translations try to make some sense of the word. So, for example, the CSB says, to bring to remembrance, and the REB says, for commemoration, and other modern translations in different languages give similar translations. The reason behind renderings like what we find in the CSB and REB, to bring to remembrance, is that elsewhere in the Bible, the word hizkir, the hifil of Zachar, means to bring to remembrance, or to commemorate. To give just one of many examples, Psalm 45:17 says, Azkira shimcha b'chol dor vador, which the ESV translates, I will cause your name to be remembered in all generations. So the word in Psalm 38, the same word, probably has something to do with remembrance, or more specifically with bringing something to remembrance, causing something to be remembered. At least one translation, the French translation abbreviated BDS, thinks that the purpose of the psalm, according to the superscription, is to bring God to remembrance, to cause us, the readers, to remember or think about God. And remembering God and remembering His works is a common theme throughout the Bible, something that God's people are supposed to do. But as you go on from the superscription to read the psalm itself, the focus isn't really on God's character or on God's past acts. The psalm really isn't a remembrance of God. Instead, the focus is more on the psalmist's suffering. And the psalm is basically a plea for God to rescue him. And so, for this reason, some translations specify that lahazkir means to cause God to remember us. For example, the NLT says, a psalm of David asking God to remember him. Or the NET says, a psalm of David written to get God's attention. Now, this view works well with the content of the psalm. In Psalm 38, the psalmist is bringing his pain and suffering before God. He's reminding God of it or bringing it to God's attention. And then the psalm ends with a prayer for help. Do not abandon me, Lord. My God, do not be far from me. Hurry to help me, my Lord, my salvation. Psalm 70, the other psalm that has lahazkir in the superscription, is also a prayer for help. It begins much in the same way that Psalm 38 ends. God, hurry to rescue me. Lord, hurry to help me. And so the view that lahazkir means to get God's attention or to cause God to remember or think of us works well. And it doesn't just work well in Psalm 38, it works well in both places where the phrase occurs as part of a superscription, Psalm 38 and Psalm 70. This view can also account for at least one other important use of the phrase להזכיר outside of the Psalms. In 1 Chronicles 16:4, we read, "Then David appointed some of the Levites as ministers before the ark of the Lord to invoke להזכיר, to thank להודות, and to praise להלל, the Lord, the God of Israel." This passage in Chronicles gives us what appears to be three genres of Israelite music. Some psalms are for praising, להלל, some are for giving thanks, להודות, and some are for bringing ourselves to God's attention in order to request His help, להזכיר, to invoke, as the ESV translates it. It seems likely that להזכיר in the superscription of Psalm 38 is marking this psalm as belonging to this particular genre. It's not a psalm for thanking or praising, it's for invoking or bringing our problem before God and asking Him to help. But there's one last option for understanding להזכיר in Psalm 38, and that is to understand it as a reference to the memorial offering. This is how the ESV has translated the phrase, memorial offering. And similarly, the CEV says a psalm by David to be used when an offering is made. The Aramaic Targum reflects a similar interpretation, a psalm of David over a bunch of frankincense as a memorial for Israel. The Septuagint might also reflect this interpretation since it mentions the Sabbath in its superscription, and the memorial offering was associated with the Sabbath. The Hebrew word for the memorial offering was the word azkara. Sometimes it's translated as the token offering. We read about it, for example, in Leviticus 24, which says, "With each row, that is, with each row of bread in the tabernacle, you shall place pure frankincense, which is to be a token offering, azkara, for the bread. As an offering by fire to the Lord, he shall arrange them before the Lord regularly every Sabbath day." And it appears that the verb hizkir, the verb in the Psalm 38 superscription, could refer to the presentation of this offering. Isaiah 66:3 says, "Whoever makes a grain offering is like one who presents pig's blood, and whoever burns memorial incense, mazkir levona, is like one who worships an idol." So it could be that להזכיר in the superscription of Psalm 38 means to offer a memorial offering, to offer the azkara. And this interpretation would work well in the context of Psalm 38 because Psalm 38 assumes a situation of sickness, and the azkara was associated with prayers of sickness. We see sickness, for example, in verse 8 of Psalm 38, which says, "My sides are full of inflammation, and there's no sound spot in my flesh." And there are other verses like that in the psalm. And we see the association between sickness and the azkara offering in a passage in Ben Sira that says, "My child, when you get sick, don't ignore it. Pray to the Lord, he will make you well. Confess all your sins and determine in the future you will live a righteous life. Offer incense, offer azkara, and a grain offering as fine as you can afford." So it could be that Psalm 38 is written for people who are sick and who are making a memorial offering to the Lord together with their prayer for healing. It's difficult to decide between this interpretation, the memorial offering interpretation, and the previous interpretation, to remind God. And it might be that both are intended, that one of the purposes of the memorial offering was to bring your suffering and need for help to God's attention. But in the end, we've gone with the remind God interpretation, and not with the memorial offering interpretation. If the psalmist wanted to indicate that the psalm was for the memorial offering, then we might have expected some more explicit expression, le'azkara, or להזכיר לבונה, like we have in Isaiah 66:3. Instead, we have a more general phrase, להזכיר. And it works well to understand this phrase in the context of Psalm 38 against the background of the 1 Chronicles passage simply as to remind God or to invoke God. We give this interpretation a C rating. The second issue in Psalm 38 is the meaning of the key in verse 16. Verse 16 is the turning point in this psalm. It's the place where the psalmist turns from talking about his own problems to declaring his trust in the Lord. He says in verse 16, "Lord, I have hoped for you. You yourself must answer, my Lord, my God." The verse begins with key, which marks or appears to mark some kind of relationship between this verse, or at least the first clause in this verse, and the surrounding discourse. But that relationship is not exactly clear, and modern translations have interpreted the key, they've translated the key in a variety of ways. According to some translations, the key is a causal conjunction, and the first half of verse 16 grounds the second half of verse 16. So the ISV, for example, says, "Because I have placed my hope in you, Lord, you will answer, Lord my God." This interpretation of the key as a causal conjunction, subordinating the first clause to the following clause, seems to make good sense in the context. The Lord answers those who hope in him, and so it makes sense that the psalmist would ground his expectation of God's deliverance in the fact that he has hoped in him. Because I've placed my hope in you, Lord, you will answer. I know that you will answer, Lord my God. The problem with this view is that when a key clause precedes its main clause, the clause that it is grounding, the information in the key clause is often known information. It can be presupposed from the discourse context. So for example, in Genesis 3:14, God says to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you. Or in Psalm 16:8, the psalmist says, I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. In both of these examples, the content of the key clause is presupposed information. But in Psalm 38, the statement, I have hoped in you, is not presupposed. Up to this point in the psalmist has been describing his distressing situation. His body's worn out, his friends have abandoned him, his enemies are trying to trap him. Verse 16 is, like we said earlier, the turning point. It's the first time in the psalm where he commits to hope in the Lord. And so the key clause in verse 16 is probably not grounding the following statement. The information in the first half of verse 16 is not presupposed. It could be that the key clause is grounding something in the preceding discourse rather than in the following clause. A number of translations reflect this view. The NLT, for example, says, For I am waiting for you, O Lord. You must answer for me, O Lord my God. And this view actually works pretty well in the context. The previous two verses say, I, like a deaf person, cannot hear, and I am like a mute person who cannot open his mouth, and so I have become like a man who does not hear, who has no arguments in his mouth. In other words, the psalmist says in verses 14 to 15 that he has remained silent in the face of his accusers. And then here in verse 16, he explains why he has remained silent. For I have trusted in you, Lord. You must answer them. In other words, I don't need to answer my accusers because you will answer them. I've trusted it in you, and it's for that reason that I have remained silent. This view works especially well with the information structure in verse 16b, where there's an explicit pronoun, you will answer. The pronoun you appears to be in marked focus, implying that it is the Lord who will answer the psalmist's enemies, and so the psalmist doesn't need to answer them himself. But on the other hand, everything up to this point in the psalm would seem to imply that David's silence before his enemies is because of his own weakness and inability. In other words, it's not so much that he refuses to respond because he's trusting in the Lord. It seems more likely that his lack of response is due to his physical weakness and his realization that there is nothing he can say or do to help himself. In verse 9, he says, I have become weak and have been crushed completely. In verse 11, he says, my heart has been pounding. My strength has abandoned me. The light of my eyes, even that is not with me. Statements like these woven throughout the first part of the psalm sufficiently explain why he's like a mute person. It's because he's too weak to respond. It's because nothing that he says or does will help him in this situation. And so it doesn't work so well to read the key in verse 16 as causal, grounding his lack of response in his hope in the Lord. His lack of response has already been explained as the result of his weakness. Another option then is to interpret the key as adversative. And a lot of translations take this option. For example, the GNT says, "But I trust in you, O Lord." And the ESV says, "But for you, O Lord, do I wait." According to this interpretation, verse 16, the profession of hope in the Lord alone, is meant to contrast with the preceding discourse. And this view makes a lot of sense in the context. In the preceding discourse, the psalmist has described how everything has abandoned him. In verse 11, he says that his strength has abandoned him. And then in verse 12, he says that his friends have abandoned him. In other words, everything he could possibly put his hope in has left him. Everything, that is, except the Lord. And so in verse 16, he turns from his distressing situation to declare his hope in the only one who has not left him. "But in you, O Lord, I have hoped. Everyone has abandoned me, but you will not abandon me, and so I have hoped in you and in you alone. You must answer my prayer." This interpretation best accounts for the flow of the discourse and the word order in verse 16. In conclusion, then, we interpret the key in verse 16 as an adversative discourse particle, marking a contrast with verse 16 and the preceding discourse. We give this conclusion a B rating. The last issue in Psalm 38 is a textual issue in the first half of verse 20. According to the ESV, the first half of this verse says, "But my foes are vigorous, they are mighty." According to the NET, however, the first half of the verse says, "But those who are my enemies for no reason are numerous." So according to the ESV, his enemies are vigorous, and according to the NET, his enemies are those who oppose him for no reason. The difference between these two translations is a difference in the underlying Hebrew texts that they are translating. The ESV is following the Masoretic text, which reads, "V'oivai chayim atzemu." They translate the word chayim, literally living. They translate it as vigorous. So the ESV, in terms of the syntax, sees two clauses here. The first clause is oivai chayim. My enemies are living or vigorous. And the second clause is atzemu. They are mighty. Other translations who follow the Masoretic text interpret the syntax and meaning a little differently. The NJPS translation, for example, says, "For my mortal enemies are numerous." This translation sees one clause here. The predicate is atzemu, and the subject is oivai chayim, my enemies with respect to life, or my mortal enemies. The CEV translates it as deadly and powerful enemies. However it is to be interpreted, the chayim reading of the Masoretic text has strong manuscript support. The Septuagint apparently read chayim. It says, "But my enemies are alive, zosin, and are stronger than I." The other ancient translations also appear to have read chayim, and they've interpreted the syntax similarly to how the ESV interprets it. My enemies are alive, or my enemies are vigorous, they are strong. Now this reading is a little awkward. Living is not exactly how we would expect for the psalmist to describe his enemies, but it does kind of make sense in the context. For most of the psalm, the psalmist has described himself as someone who is wasting away from an illness, someone on the brink of death. And now he says here, by way of contrast, that his enemies are alive and well, chayim and atzemu. The root atzam is even repeated in the psalm to underscore this contrast. In verse 4, the psalmist says, "There is no well-being in my bones." The word for bones is utzamai. And here in verse 20, he says that his enemies are mighty, atsemu. So there are good arguments in favor of the Masoretic texts reading Chaim. This reading has strong manuscript support. It's an ancient reading, and it makes sense in the wider context of the psalm. The NET, which we mentioned and quoted earlier, follows a different reading. Instead of Chaim, its underlying Hebrew text reads Chinam, an adverb that means without cause or for no reason. But those who are my enemies for no reason are numerous. The NIV also says, many have become my enemies without cause. This reading, Chinam, is found in our earliest Hebrew manuscript of this passage, 4Q Psalms A. 4Q Psalms A is actually probably the oldest Hebrew Psalms manuscript known to be in existence, older than all of the other Dead Sea Scrolls Psalms manuscripts. The editors in the DJD volume date it to the middle of the 2nd century BC. This reading, Chinam, also makes really good sense in the context. Notice that the following clause, the parallel line, refers to the fact that his enemies are opposing him for no reason, and those who hate me without cause, sona'ai shaker, are numerous. The following verse, verse 21, then goes on to elaborate on this idea. And those who repay with evil in response to good accuse me in response to my pursuit of good. Further support for the Chinam reading comes from similar passages elsewhere in the Psalter where we find Chinam in similar contexts. For example, Psalm 69 verse 5 says, those who hate me without reason, sona'ai Chinam, outnumber the hairs of my head. Many, atsemu, many are my enemies without cause, oyevai sheker. There are striking similarities between this verse and Psalm 38:20. Both verses have the parallel, my enemies and those who hate me. Both verses use the verb atsemu or atsemu to describe the enemy's strength, and both verses use the word sheker to describe the unjust opposition of the enemies. The important thing to note is that Psalm 69:5 uses the word chinam, not the word chaim. It seems likely then that chinam is the earlier reading in Psalm 38:20. It creates a clear parallel with Psalm 69:5 and other similar passages. It best fits the immediate context, and it's supported by our earliest Hebrew manuscript. The reading Chaim, to be sure, it's the more difficult reading, but it's probably the result of a scribal error. A scribe accidentally mistook the nun in Chinam for a yod, and he wrote Chaim. We give this interpretation an A rating. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. The first issue, the interpretation of להזכיר, affects how we understand the purpose of the psalm. It is to remind God, to bring our need to God's attention in hope that He will answer. The second issue, the interpretation of the key in verse 16, affects how we understand the most significant movement within the psalm. Verse 16 marks the turning point, where the psalmist first verbalizes his commitment to trust in the Lord and to wait on the Lord to answer. Everyone else has abandoned him, all of his friends, and even his own strength, but the Lord will never abandon him. And so he says in verse 16, "But I have hoped in you." The third issue, the textual issue in verse 20, helps us see more clearly how the psalmist perceived and described his enemies. Yes, they are many and mighty. Yes, they're stronger than him, but also emphasized in verse 20 is the fact that they are opposing him without cause. They're his enemies for no good reason. He's done nothing but good to them, and in response to his pursuit of good, they accuse him of doing wrong. And so he takes his case to the Lord, to the one who is just, to the one who will never abandon him. And he pleads, "Do not abandon me, Lord. My God, do not be far from me. Hurry to help me, my Lord, my salvation." This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 38, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. Our overview video provides a coherent interpretation of the psalm, and our poetry video explores the beauty of the psalm as a poem. All of these videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at scriptura.org to learn more.